You say that happiness is not a place we can reach and rest in. Instead, happiness is a direction we can walk along. And then you add discipline is freedom. And then you say life is about cultivating independence. So many big words. So let's talk about happiness, freedom, and independence. I like all three.
I say that happiness is a direction, it's not a place.
Mm-hmm.
It's when our brain releases some neurotransmitters.
Mm-hmm.
It releases them usually when a change happens.
Mm-hmm.
The optimal amount of freedom is not 100%. You will not be able to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
You need to use part of your schedule to remove problem and to create the resources that will enable to use the rest of your schedule as free as you want. It's true that there are some people that in the search for independence, they become antisocial,
Mm-hmm.
but you can be independent while being part of a group,
right,
or of a social structure.
Our overall well-being can benefit from independence.
Yes.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, investor, and a founding partner of Sicard Associates, a boutique investment firm founded in New York City. Join me on this quest to unearth the wisdom of the ages. I'll keep it short. If you want to get in touch with me, head over to my website, Bogumil Baranowski, where I read your emails and reply to all, and I even offer Zoom calls to you, my listeners. If you want to follow my essays, go to Substack. If you're curious about my last book, Search for Crisis Investing. If you want to keep up with Talking Billions, subscribe, follow, and please share it around. It means the world to me. There's no marketing budget behind the podcast. There's no ad revenue. It's all word of mouth and genuine curiosity, yours, mine, and that of our guests. On to the show. My guest today is Luca Dellanna. Luca is a management advisor focused on increasing revenue through better people and operations management. After a master's degree in automotive engineering, Luca spent the first part of his career working for DuPont's consulting unit in Frankfurt, Germany. There, he focused on managerial excellence projects in a variety of manufacturing industries all across Europe. In 2015, Luca moved back to his hometown of Turin, Italy, and opened a private consulting practice serving clients worldwide. He has also published books about management, human behavior, and economics. Those books earned him appearances on the most important conferences and podcasts in this field. Luca lives with his wife, Wenlin, and his dog, Didi, and divides his time between Turin and Singapore. Last time we discussed Luca's excellent book, Ergodicity. I highly recommend the episode. You can look it up and hear his thoughts on game overs, do-overs, and the idea that not the fastest skier wins the race, but the fastest that completes all the races without breaking a leg. Today, we'll talk about 3 other books that Luca wrote. First, we will discuss his book 100 Truths That You Will Learn Too Late. Luca explains how most frustration and unhappiness in your life will come from disrespecting the rules of whatever game you're a participant of, be it love, business, health, or social life. Then we discuss how few successful people took a direct path to success. Successful people know what they want, but not what it will look like. Luca has interesting thoughts about willpower. He says willpower is best used to create a short burst of activity whose purpose is not to achieve a result, but to create conditions for sustainable results. Luca tells me that happiness is not a place we can reach and rest in. Instead, happiness is a direction we can walk along. Finally, in his book about life's truths, he writes, "Discipline is freedom. Life is about cultivating independence." In the Control Heuristic book, Luca writes why we sometimes take actions that are clearly bad for us. He also writes about optical illusions, how we see narratives where there are none, and how we estimate the truth. We further talk about the ego, past experiences, and take a different look at pain. Luca also wrote a book about managing remote teams. We have a lively discussion about the future of work, with the emphasis on relearning how to work, clarity of communication, and the need for trust between the employer and employees. I always learn so much from Luca, and I hope you do too. Please help me welcome Luca Dellanna. Well, hello, Luca. It's so nice to see you. How are you?
Hi, Bogumil. Thank you for having me.
I mean, what a pleasure. We had such a wonderful conversation a few months ago about your book, Ergodicity. And we talked about a lot of things, but the topic that really resonated with me was the idea of game overs and do-overs in life, personally speaking and professionally speaking. The idea was really relevant in career where you don't want to take certain risks. And then in a personal life, sometimes we take bigger risks than we think. But I highly recommend everybody to go back and listen to Luca's episode on Talking Billions. But today I want to talk to you about 3 books. And I know that you wrote many more, but I took on 3 books that you highly recommended. And I spent this summer reading all 3. And let's start with the first one, which has an amazing title, 100 Truths You Will Learn Too Late. I mean, Luca, tell me more. How did this idea come about?
Yes, I wrote this book because I've noticed that during the first part of my life, I had a lot of frustrating experiences, which all had one thing in common. I was trying to participate in some activity, maybe some social activity, maybe in business, and I didn't know some of the fundamental rules that was governing that activity. And sometimes, even if you miss just one rule, even if you put a lot of work, determination, skills, and talent, you might still not get results out of it. And that's extremely frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, over the course of the years, I've learned some of these rules and I've become much more effective and happy. And then I decided to write this book so that others can learn these rules faster.
I have this quote from your book that rhymes with what you just shared. Most frustration and unhappiness in your life will come from disrespecting the rules of whatever game you are a participant of, be it love, business, health, or social life. It's so true, but we went through education, schools, and all kinds of training. Nobody really puts it that way. How do we learn those rules? Sometimes you join a game and you're not even aware that you're part of a certain game.
Yes, I think that one key thing is to understand that everything has rules. Whether it's a game or it's not a game, anything has rules.
Mm-hmm.
So already if you think that it doesn't have rules, you're probably wrong and you're missing something. And then sometimes you can just learn the rules by observing others, asking questions, careful to observe those who had sustained success, not like very brief success, because that could be given by taking shortcuts, but then you get negative consequences shortly thereafter. And then the second thing is that very often we know about some rule and yet we choose to disrespect it. And this is actually also very often. We always think, maybe this rule doesn't apply to us. Maybe we can get away without respecting it. And it's very seldom the case. And something that I've discovered is that maybe it's true that sometimes you can get lucky and get away with not respecting the rule, but it's so infrequent that you are much better off just by assuming that the rules of the game apply to you.
It's so important in the world of investing. As you know, we manage money for families and individuals, wealthy families and individuals. And when you get started in investing, you try to figure out what are the rules of the game, what are the principles that helped others succeed. And you realize that many others were there before you. And obviously, they're big and famous legendary investors like Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, many others that we all follow. And there are certain principles that they applied that worked. And there are even books called What Has Worked on Wall Street that tested all kinds of approaches. So the investment world, the stock market, is a bit of a lab where you can go in and use actually historic data to test what has worked, what hasn't worked. Is buying cheap stocks a good idea, or buying momentum stocks a good idea, or big or large or whatever? But there are places where it's less of a lab and it's even harder to figure out those principles. You have many rules, the 100 rules, but rule 16 really made me pause. It's a rule about seeking control. You say, do not seek control. And it's a very powerful statement. You say how few successful people took a direct path to success. Successful people know what they want, but not what it will look like. I like that a lot, and I have a follow-up question, but tell me more where this idea came from and how you discovered it.
Yeah, this idea came from observing both entrepreneurs, and I've noticed that a lot of the entrepreneurs which are very famous and successful right now, they didn't know that they would become famous and successful that way. Maybe they had the idea that, for example, I will work very hard, I will open a company and I will become successful. But maybe they didn't know what product. Or maybe they had an idea for the product, but then they had to change this idea. And of course, in history, we always see with the back mirror, and it always looked like it was inevitable. It always looks like the big idea was the first idea that the people had. But no, very often they change their mind multiple times. I'm thinking about Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber. He has a blog post from the beginning of Uber. I think he was 2 years in, and he talks about Uber just as if it's one of the 6 or 7 projects he was working at the time. And of course, now we're watching with the hindsight, and it looks like he went all in on Uber, and that's one of his life projects. But it wasn't like this at the start. He started a lot of things, and then of course, with time, as some things failed, either they got more momentum, then he prioritized the most successful. And I see this with a lot of things. I see it with love. A lot of times you talk to someone, they've been married for 30 years, and it looks like, of course, with hindsight, that's the person that will make them happy and so on. But if you look at the moment just before the first date, did they know that was the kind of person they were looking for? Not really. Maybe they knew 1 or 2 things, but definitely not with precision. And I see it most importantly with happiness. I say that most people don't want to be happy. They want to be happy in a very specific way. And therefore, they end up unhappy.
Wow, you're touching. Go ahead.
No, that's it. So myself, my wife always asks me, like, for example, what's your dream? And my dream is like to be happy, to have a happy family. And then she asked me, yeah, but what does it mean particularly? And I'm like, I don't know. I just know that I want to be happy. I want to have a happy family. I want to be like fairly happy with my job, but I have no idea what my job will look like in 30 years.
How did the two of you meet?
We met in Japan, completely by chance. I was there for business. She was there on a project during her sabbatical, and we randomly met and at a gathering, and then I asked her out for the following breakfast, and
And now you're living in Italy together.
Yes, happily married since 3 years and a half.
Oh, wow.
And,
Congratulations.
Thank you.
When you said happiness, it made me think of this idea that happiness is one of many things that we cannot accomplish in a direct way. It's an indirect path. And there's even a saying that the more you chase happiness, the more elusive it becomes. It's the other things that the product of those pursuits happiness might be, but happiness by itself is very hard to pursue or impossible to pursue in a direct way. And there's a term obliquity that you and I might have briefly talked about, of indirect pursuit of many different things in life, including success, love, and happiness. And I'm thinking of a talk that I listened to by Ken Robinson, who is an education expert. He gave a TED talk, but I was actually in a live audience. He was giving a talk in New York. And the summary of it was, when you look at the resume of a person, it was obvious that you will do medical school and go to this clinic and do that kind of research and then write this book and then get this award. But actually, at the moment This person might have been interested in music and wanted to pursue art, and then had a short spell as an entrepreneur, and then thought about quitting the clinic. And so he actually tells the whole story, and I don't remember all the details, but it was something about a medical profession, I believe. My parents are doctors, so that's why I related to that. And I realized it's so true, because when you look at anybody's resume, it's obvious that I am where I was supposed to be, but it's not, because there are different moments and different pivots, which something you talk about with Uber. We have to pivot professionally and personally at times, and the path is not as direct. And I think surrendering control and focusing on what you want, but accepting that it may come to you in a different way that you thought. I think that's where you're going with that. I think it's a beautiful way of putting it. You have a wonderful quote about willpower, and there are books about willpower, and willpower is something that I mention in my books, because in investing, there are moments when your patience gets tested, your discipline gets tested. Once you buy a stock, you find all the reasons to sell it, and other people will volunteer reasons for you to sell it, and so on. So willpower seems like a very crucial thing, but you present it in a different way. You say that willpower is best used to create a short burst of activity whose purpose is not to achieve a result, but to create the conditions for sustainable results. I think it's brilliant, but tell me more.
I can make a very simple example with eating habits. You have two ways of using willpower. The first one is that you keep some sweets, some cookies in your house, and every time you pass in front of the cookies, you have to use willpower not to eat them. And not only it's very likely that you fail,
right?
But even if you succeed, it's going to be effortful and painful. Or you can use willpower in a short burst to create the conditions, which means you take the cookies and you give them away, for example, or you store at your parents or something like that. And once you've done it, everything else is much easier in your life. And I think that applies to a lot of areas of your life. Use willpower, sure, but try to use it in a way where you change your environment rather than having to use it every single day, day after day. That's not sustainable.
It made me think of a diet and a cookie as you're talking. And initially, when I thought of willpower as you're going to present a cookie to me every day, and I will refuse to accept it, right? So there will be a temptation, and I will say no. The same way you buy a stock, you check the price every minute of the day, and you refuse to sell it. And especially if it's going down for a brief period of time, you get tested. But the way you present it is, don't have the cookie in front of you, or don't check the daily price quote. Instead of exposing yourself to a massive test of your willpower on a regular basis, use that burst of willpower to rearrange your life, your circumstances in a way where you're not tested with that cookie, or you're not tested with the ease of selling a stock that you just bought. So that's how I looked at it. And I thought, this is a much more powerful way of using willpower than proving that my willpower is so strong that no matter what the temptation and whatever the reason, I will persevere. That's wonderful. But make it a bit easier for yourself and create conditions and an environment that works for you. It makes me think of so many investors, including Buffett, that moved away from New York to Omaha to have peace and quiet, and Guy Spear, that we both know, moved to Zurich, where he has a very quiet, structured life. I visited his office. It overlooks a nice street and a garden, and it's a place where you can think and sit, and he has a reading room and so on. So I feel like creating the right environment where you're not poked and you can focus on what's important to you. I wrote down a couple of things, and we'll go back to happiness, discipline, freedom, and independence. And let me share those quotes with you from the book, The 100 Rules. You say that happiness is not a place we can reach and rest in. Instead, happiness is a direction we can walk along. And then you add discipline is freedom. And then you say life is about cultivating independence. So many big words. So let's talk about happiness, freedom, and independence. I like all three.
Thank you. Just one thing, the quote about freedom comes from, discipline is freedom, comes from Ed Latimore. I
Uh-huh.
think that in the book I quoted, I say that happiness is a direction, is not a place.
Mm-hmm.
And this comes direct from neurology.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you think about it, a lot of happiness, exhilaration, and so on, it's when our brain releases some neurotransmitters,
Mm-hmm.
like some chemicals. And it releases them usually when a change happens.
Mm-hmm.
For example, very simple example, you're alone, then maybe your spouse walks in, you're happy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the change.
Right.
Uh, or some good piece of news happens,
Mm-hmm.
or you start doing your favorite activity, or that's a change.
Mm-hmm.
That our brain releases dopamine and all the other neurochemicals in response to a change. And then what happens is that so if it releases them as a change, it means that it cannot be a steady state.
Right.
And so that's what I mean. The idea that there can be a steady state in which we keep feel happy, it's mostly an illusion.
Mm-hmm.
It cannot really happen. What it can happen, we can have a life in which we can have a lot of these events that make us happy, of course, with some variety, because if there is no variety, it's almost as if it's a steady state. I don't know, for example, you can take your favorite dish. My favorite dish is lasagna.
Mm-hmm.
And every time that I eat lasagna, definitely my brain is incredibly happy. But if
Mm-hmm.
I ate lasagna every day, after a few times, my brain will stop releasing the chemicals.
Uh-huh.
So you need variety to keep engaging your brain with change in a way that makes you happy.
On that top.
And this is all the reasonings that go beyond this quote.
Yeah, it's the idea of utility. I had a conversation with Victor Hagani, who was the founding partner of Long-Term Capital Management, and he wrote a book, Missing Billionaires, where he makes an argument that we should have more billionaire heirs among us, and money got lost over the few generations, and what can we learn from it? But he was talking about utility and gummy bears, which resonates with me and rhymes with what you're saying, how the first gummy bear gives us a lot of pleasure, the 100th gummy bear doesn't. So happiness is more of a journey than a destination, but overindulgence on something that initially gave you happiness or satisfaction may not be the path. So it's a very curious journey where you want to stay motivated and intrigued and interested and have the appetite, so to speak, yet not overindulge. And then freedom is a big word, and it keeps coming back in my conversations, and you and I spoke about it, and I had many guests talk about freedom. It's really interesting because we start talking about business and money, and people talk about time and freedom. And you say, you mentioned the quote, discipline is freedom. Tell me more about that. How do we look at it the right way?
Yeah, so again, that is a quote from Ed Latimore. I quoted him because I think in 3 words, he's expressing a very big principle, which is that, again, you cannot have perfect steady state freedom. If you try to live every single minute of your schedule as if you were free, maybe you can sustain that for 1 week, for 1 month, but then your life will start to get into trouble. And the optimal amount of freedom is not 100%. You will not be able to achieve that. You need to use part of your schedule to remove problem and to create the resources that will enable to use the rest of your schedule as free as you want. Right. So this is the first rule. You cannot aim for 100% freedom. Like, of course, it would be better if it were possible. Sadly, it's not possible. And once you acknowledge that, then it becomes much easier to organize your schedule. You understand that once you accept that some things will be necessary, for example, to have freedom with your body, you will have to spend 2-3 hours a week exercising.
Right.
To have a freedom with your time, you will have to spend at least a few hours engaging in business, or if you're retired, in managing your money or something like that, and so on. And that's the principle.
It's a more balanced approach, not just the candy, but also the effort to get the candy, so to speak.
Yes.
And then you talk about independence, and you mention how life is about cultivating independence. And it's a big word, and it also keeps coming back in my conversations. Even when people talk about money and financial independence, they want to reach a certain level of wealth where they can have full control of their time. Can you talk about cultivating independence? How do you look at it?
Yes. So the first thing is that very often people see independence sometimes as a synonym with either solitude or antisocial or something like that, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is completely unnecessary. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's true that there are some people that in the search for independence, they become antisocial,
Mm-hmm.
but you can be completely independent. You can be, for example, in a relationship with your spouse and be independent. Doesn't mean that you live alone. It just means that you can do things on your own.
Right.
Maybe then you spend 100% of the time with the other person, but it means that you can do some things on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Some things you can be an employee and still be independent, in the sense that if your employer fired you tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
you would have another job the next month, and it will then be big trouble. Then it
Right.
doesn't mean that you're looking for another job. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
you're only loyal and dedicated, but you can
Mm-hmm.
be loyal and dependent, or you
Mm-hmm.
can be loyal and independent. And the point I'm making is that you can be you can be independent while being part of a group,
Right.
or of a social structure. And if you do, you will enjoy that much more.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, the example of the employee who is independent, he's still very loyal for the company, but because he's independent, for example, he feels like he can talk about the problems.
Right.
Whereas maybe an employee which feels dependent, he will think, oh, maybe I cannot raise this question to my boss. And therefore, he will be very much less effective. Or the same thing in a romantic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel that you are too dependent on the other person, maybe you will start doing everything as per the other person's preferences. And then maybe not only it will make your life miserable, but maybe you will discover that even your partner doesn't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't they would like the other person to be more independent. And so I strongly suggest that at least some level of independence can dramatically improve your business, your relationship,
Sounds like
your employment, anything.
our overall well-being can benefit from independence.
Yes.
And the second thing that I'm hearing is that it has many dimensions. It can be financial, it can be intellectual, it can be emotional. I'm sure there are more, but in what you mentioned, I see at least those three. When you work or your investments, then you're thinking of in terms of financial independence, emotional, romantically, or friendship, and intellectual independence is pretty tricky because when you work for somebody, you want to be able to say, oh, this is not done the way it should be. And actually the company, the whole corporate organism can benefit from that kind of feedback. So it's interesting how that kind of independence could be cultivated. I want to move to the next book, The Control Heuristic, that you really recommended. And I read it very slowly because it's so rich. There's so many different ideas. And today we'll touch on a handful. So I highly recommend everybody going back to all your books. But with this one, I really took my time. And you talk about the idea that we individuals can take actions that are clearly bad for us. And I'm thinking of investors that do things that are clearly bad for them. But then you add a very optimistic and hopeful premise that at the end of the book, you will have the most comprehensive understanding of your actions, your hidden motives, and what to do to change your habits. Why do we do something that's not good for us?
Yeah, so the key is to understand that our brain doesn't act like a single unit.
Mm-hmm.
there are multiple organs or parts inside our brain. For example, we have the cortex, and we have other areas, for example, the basal ganglia. And the cortex, we all know about it. It's the part that looks a bit like a walnut, the part of the brain that we humans have, particularly compared to other animals. And that enables us to think in the future, to analyze things.
Mhm.
And so with the cortex, we can take decisions which are very complex and look in the future. For example, I should go on a diet, or I should work very hard on getting a degree, for example. And then we have another part of our brain, for example, the basal ganglia, that is much more primitive and cannot think in the long term.
Mhm.
And for example, it cannot think about whether a diet will be good for us. It can only think about the action in front of us. It can only think if eating a cookie will be
Mhm.
good for us.
Right.
And our cortex maybe knows that eating a cookie is not so good for us because the cortex knows about the future consequences. It can think about the future. The basal ganglia cannot think about the future. It can only think in terms of feeling. So,
Mhm.
cookie, does it feel good or not?
Mm.
And if the answer is feel good, then the basal ganglia says eat. And the way these parts of our brain are linked is that the basal ganglia sits between the cortex and our muscles.
Mhm.
Now making a lot of simplifications because in the podcast we cannot go in details, but you can think about it. So
Mhm.
maybe our cortex thinks we shouldn't eat the cookie because I don't know. We already ate a cake this morning.
Mhm.
Our basal ganglia cannot think about the past, cannot think about the future. Only thinks cookie good, eat, and that's what we might end up doing. So that's the base mechanism. Then of course, like the basal ganglia the cortex can take other actions. For example, especially when the cookie is out of sight.
Right.
We can, for example, store it away. We can think about other things. We can make, I don't know, promises with other people. But
Mhm.
that's basically the structure. And the moment you realize that the brain doesn't think at one,
Mhm.
a lot of things that previously didn't make sense, you finally understand why they happen.
It's fascinating how much of that decision making in life, in business, in investing is based on the emotion, the feeling. It just doesn't feel right, or this feels very good. And it can lead to trouble in many places. So, the behavior that we developed over millions of years through evolution that led us to the better fruit or the better source of protein or calories, when we apply it to the modern world, it can get us in trouble. And the consequences might be not as beneficial as it would be taking the nicest fruit from the tree and so on. The other thing, when you mentioned the cookie, and I like how the cookie keeps coming back in this conversation, I had Lucas Miller, who is a UC Berkeley professor, and he talks about the brain and he talks about the phone, how they do studies that if the phone is with you in the room, even in front of you, and they test your mental capacity, simple tests. They remove the phone is in your pocket, the phone is visible, the phone is face up, face down. But the presence of the phone is taking away from your mental abilities. And it's something that we don't notice, we don't see, but it's a fact. So if we're working in an environment where we have multiple screens, multiple phones, and he adds even worse, people walking past us, behind us, which on an evolutionary level was always danger, you're not as efficient and productive mentally as you think you are, especially if you're an traditional office worker providing your knowledge and expertise.
Exactly. And let me just build on this because to understand, because when you say you have a phone in front of you, that's what the cortex perceives, because the cortex is very evolved and knows what the phone is for and so on. The basal ganglia basically only thinks in terms of neurotransmitters. And when you have a phone in front of you, what it perceives is you have a source of dopamine in front of you.
Right.
That's it. And if you have two things in front of you, one is a I don't know, the laptop on which you're supposed to do your work.
Uh-huh.
And the other one is the phone on which you can check Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And your brain is basically saying, I have one source of effort on the left, and I have a source of dopamine on the right.
Uh-huh.
Why would I not immediately reach for the source of dopamine?
There you go.
That's exactly the thing. And you mentioned if you have someone working at the back,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the cortex knows that the person working at the back is a colleague, or maybe you're sitting in a cafe and it's an innocuous passerby.
Uh-huh.
But maybe instead the basal ganglia thinks, oh, a source of risk behind me.
Right.
So when you start seeing the things from the point of view of the basal ganglia, lot of these behaviors make sense.
Do you think the awareness of it is the first step to addressing it? Just being aware, as you said, that there are two different brains giving us two different feedbacks. Is that a good place to start?
I think it's a good place to start. And the second component is that if your problem is the basal ganglia, you need to talk to the basal ganglia. You cannot talk to the cortex, because the cortex already knows is already on board. So for example, let's say that if I wanted to exercise in the morning, and I already took the decision that I want to do it. My problem is that I'm not doing it. It means that my cortex is already on board. She knows that I'm supposed to exercise in the morning. So trying to find solutions to the problem that appeal to the cortex, for example, more reasoning, etc., will not do a thing if the bottleneck is the other part of the brain, for example, the basal ganglia.
That makes sense.
In terms of which of the two parts of the brain is the bottleneck, and let's focus on that one.
We were just talking about self-harm, actions that are not good for us. And you explained how we engage in those actions, although we shouldn't. And at the same time, you explained how we have trouble taking actions that are good for us. And it's a dance between risk and resistance. So tell me more, what's happening over there?
Yes. So we calibrated our behavior and our decision-making for what made sense in our environment, in our ancestors' environment. And for example, in our ancestors' environment, nutrients were so rare, like we had the difficulty finding calories, that basically the rule, eat sugar whenever you see it, was a good rule. And now our brain kept that rule because our brain is encoded by the genes that change much more slower than our environment. And nowadays, instead, it's a bad rule. You don't want to eat every single piece of sugar that comes across. And the same applies to a lot of other things. And especially in our complex environment of today, there are a lot of things where the long term is different from the short term.
Right.
And in the past, it wasn't necessarily like that. And we didn't adapt very well for that. So there are all these mismatches between what the environment that our genes are for and the environment of today, and we have trouble sometimes navigating it.
In the investment world, I realized that investing is not a feel-good pursuit, because most of the time it's actually very uncomfortable. The best purchases you can make is when the price is down, when the business is out of favor, but there's still a reason to see some improvement over time. And then you have to wait a long time to see the results, and you don't know if it's going to take a year or 5 years. So usually you see the benefits looking back. Oh, I'm glad I started investing 20 years ago, but it's very hard looking forward. And then there's so many moments where your conviction gets tested. So it's not a feel-good kind of pursuit. If anything, most of the experience we've collected that you mentioned, food or sugar or cookies, are really not helping us in the world of investing. And there's other thing that you write in your book, Control Heuristic, that really resonated with me as an investor. You call it optical illusions. And I really like it because I feel like in the investment world, there are many optical illusions, and I'll let you explain what it means, but you write how we see narratives where there are none, and that's how we estimate the truth. I mean, that's the stock market, but it's not just the stock market, but tell me more what it means.
Yeah, so you can think about, we see a lot of illusions. For example, sometimes you can see a building with 3 windows, and maybe you see a face in the building, or you can see a face in the cloud. And what happens is that our brain is a pattern matching machine.
Right.
And if it sees 2 or 3 features, it sees a pattern. Why? So the reason is because, again, even our cortex, it looks like a single organ, but it's made of multiple brain regions, each that act independently from each other. And the thing is, you can think about it. I make the analogy as a company. A company is made of employees. Each employee only knows a fraction of the thing that the other employees know, and they take the independent decision. For example, the guy in purchasing, he doesn't know what the guy in sales knows about. They know different things. Each take decisions by themselves. But if you are an observer external to the company, it looks to you as if the company was taking decision as a single entity.
Right.
How many times on the newspaper you hear Apple decided to do this? But it's not what happened. A lot of single employees each took a different decision. Now, sorry. What happens with narratives? A narrative is what a region of our brain does when it doesn't understand why the other region of the brain took an action. For example, let's say that you have a part of your brain that decided to felt cold and decided to close the window. Maybe another part of the brain doesn't know why it happened, and maybe we'll get another reason. In our brain, everything is very well connected, so we usually know about those reasons. But for example, there are patients in which, for example, the 2 hemispheres of the brain are separate, and you see that they have a lot of weird behaviors. They behave normal in their life, but for example, if you whisper in the right ear, can you please close the window? They will go and they close the window, and then you go to the other ear, to the left ear, and you ask them, why did you close the window? They don't know, because one hemisphere doesn't know about what the other one knows. And then when the brain doesn't know why we did something, they guess what's the most plausible answer, and they accept it as true. This is the critical point. They accept it as true. So in the experiment I told you before, the patient would think that they closed the window because they felt cold. And the thing is that they will really believe it.
They make up a story. They make up a story and they believe it.
They don't think, oh, I don't know why I did it. What's the most likely reason? They truly believe that they did it because they felt cold. And the same applies to our brain. A lot of times when we don't know why something happened, very few times we are genuinely confused and we can acknowledge the confusion. A lot of times we just guess what's the most likely explanation and we take it as true.
Narratives are very powerful in life, in politics, and in investing. And as any tool, it can be used in various ways, good and bad and so on. But I'm thinking of a daily price move. I'm always amused how the price of let's say the index goes up, the US index, European index, Asian index goes up 1%. And all the journalists and sometimes all the talking heads, experts volunteer to say why the market is up today. And it's interesting because if the market is up today, we have to look for reasons why it's up today. If it was down today, same day, with the same events, we would have to select the events and the stories to tell us why it's down. Well, it's up because oil is up. If it was down, we would say, oh, it's down because oil is up. So we would make the facts and what actually happened fit the narrative that serves a certain purpose. And I completely ignore the daily moves. I'm much more interested in the long-term story. And a lot of managements find it refreshing when I ask them, where do you see this business in 3, 5, 10 years? And they say, nobody ever asks about anything beyond the next few quarters. It's kind of interesting to have that conversation, but that's the reality we live in. So narratives are great if they're used in a certain way. And as humans, we are just built to make up stories. We've been making up stories and collecting stories and passing on stories since we started speaking. So I think it will stay with us. You talk about the ever-changing world around us and some emergency behaviors, and then you introduce the concept of ego. And a lot of people talk about ego, but you shape it in a different way that really spoke to me. You talk about the ego as built on the past experiences and the pain, something that moves us away from the future damage. Can you talk about that? How do we think about it the right way?
Yes. So there is a common misconception that pain is a signal of damage.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, it's a signal of vulnerability. And I make an example. If you try to touch a boiling pot, and you touch it for only a split second, your finger will feel pain. But if you look at your finger, there is no damage. That's because pain is a signal of a vulnerability. It's a sign of, if you don't adapt your behavior, damage will come.
I see.
Then, of course, in a lot of situations in real life, the two things coincide. Damage, and that's because damage brings vulnerability. For example, if I twist my ankle, it's painful. But it's not painful. The damage triggered the pain. But what the pain is telling me is not your damage, is you are in a vulnerable state, such as if you keep walking on the ankle, you will damage yourself even more.
I see.
So if you think about it, if for 1 second you think pain is not a signal of damage, but is a signal of vulnerability, and you think about the time in your life where you felt pain, you will notice that it makes much more sense. So that's what I meant. And then instead about the ego, the point I make is that what we generally call ego is actually the things that we believe are good for us. I make an example. If you put a person that puts a lot of ego in their car, ends up doing what's best for the car rather than what's best for them. For example, they start paying for cars, they start spending, the Sunday morning washing the car instead of spending time with their family or working out, something like that. If you put a lot of ego in your career, for example, you will start doing what's good for your career, even if it's not good for you.
Right.
And so on. And the thing is, if you put your ego in yourself, careful whether you put it in your current self or in your future self. Because if you put your ego in your current self, who you are right now, you will start doing things which are good for who you are right now, and that are bad for your future self. And if instead you put your ego in your future selves, you will start doing things which are good for your future self, even if they are not necessarily good for you now. And to some degree, it can be a conscious choice where you put your ego in.
I'm thinking of the past experiences and the pain, and ego comes to it too. And in the investment world, I noticed something, especially among seasoned investors that have seen a lot of market crashes, experienced a lot of pain. It's really a physical pain to lose money. And they might have scared themselves out of the market. I even heard the anecdote that Ben Graham, the father of value investing, in the later years was not participating in the stock market. And obviously he might have been comfortable by that point and was not interested. But one of the stories was that he believed that the next Great Depression, which made such a huge impression on him early in his life, that it's around the corner. And I've heard a version of the story from many, many seasoned investors after many decades in the market. And it becomes the pain avoidance gets in the way of actually pursuing something that's good for you in the future. How do you think about that?
Well, that's a wonderful example because you're saying pain from investing, which is true. But the question is, pain is a signal of vulnerability. What was the behavior that caused the vulnerability? Is it staying invested? Is it over-investing? Is it investing in a way that opens you to bankruptcy and something like this? And so it's very important whenever you feel pain to redirect it to the right thing. I make an example. My dog, a few months ago, he was running near a fence, and then he tripped because there was an obstacle that usually is never there. He tripped on the obstacle, he hit the fence, and he wounded himself. On the other side of the fence, there was a dog. Now my dog is scared of the dog. And the dog didn't do anything. Is that my dog misinterpreted the accident. And he thought that the pain came from the other dog and not from the fence or from running without looking where he was running to. So pain is usually a good signal, like it's there for a reason. We evolved it for a reason. The question is always make sure that you direct it to the right behavior, to the behavior which was creating the vulnerability that created the pain.
It's interesting because it almost sounds like a failure in the interpretation of the experience.
Exactly.
And it's a brilliant observation that you have with your dog. But it happens to all of us. And I'm thinking in the investment world, Ben Graham walked away from the Great Depression thinking, I'm going to be prepared in case it happens again. And Phil Fisher, who is the other inspiration for Warren Buffett, in one of his books, if you actually read carefully the early pages of the book, he says that a crisis like the Great Depression is unlikely to happen ever again. And he explains the monetary setup of the system, not linked to gold the same way and so on, that it's not going to repeat the same way. So same experience, but very different lessons that people walked away from. Oh, this is great. Makes me thinking about pain and past experiences in a different way. I want to talk to you about the third book that I was reading, which is Managing Remote Teams. And you've been working with hybrid and remote teams for over a decade, since 2008. Has it been 15 years or more? And many of us have tried remote work in a very unusual context of a pandemic in the last 3-4 years. I think that everybody that could try it, tried it. And because it was a strange setup and because we were not ready and because it was forced on us, I think we walked away with a range of experiences. And to this day, 4 years later, I think it's a very polarizing topic. Some people feel very strongly that it works. Some people feel very strongly that it doesn't. What are your thoughts? How do we continue this discussion when the topic is becoming a taboo, when people don't even want to admit that they're actually working remotely sometimes?
Yeah, it's very polarizing discussion exactly because we had different experiences. Like if you had, for example, a boss that doesn't know how to write clear emails, for example, probably you had a bad experience with working remotely. And if instead you had a boss who is very good at delegating over emails and very clear, maybe instead you had a very good experience. The thing is that the experience you had is much less likely to be with remote working, but rather with the way remote working was done at your company.
Right.
Just like meetings. There are some people that hate meetings. There are other people that love meetings. A lot of the times, it's about how the meeting is done. Meetings with people who are very concise, they go to the point, they ask the right questions, then probably you love meetings. And if instead, the people that attend the meetings you attend, they take 30 minutes to say something that could have done in 3 minutes, probably you hate meetings. It's not much about the meeting itself. It's about the skills of the people with doing meetings. And the same applies to remote working. Your experience with remote working probably is not about remote working. It's about the fact that you work with people who are bad at working remotely.
It's very true. But I feel like the cat is out of the bag. And something got started during the pandemic and something got accelerated And remote work is one of 1,000 different things, but this is a big thing for companies, for cities. I'm thinking of New York. I was reading that the vacancy rate in parts of Manhattan is about 25%. And that's what I saw the other day. It was 18 overall, I think 25 in Midtown, which is unbelievable. But that's what you see and you feel in New York, walking around or even visiting people in their offices, how the offices are empty. So something has shifted and something has happened. So the question that I have for you is the idea of relearning how to work. And I think it might come easier for younger people, but it's also challenging for younger people because they might not have the same exposure to senior employees because they're not there every day and so on. But somebody that spent 30 years in a cubicle in a physical environment where they wouldn't even write an email, they would walk over to Bob and tell Bob what to do. They're lost. So everybody from somebody that's joining the firm all the way to somebody 2 years from retirement, there are different levels and different ways of being lost in this new transition.
Yes, and some very quick tips on, for example, on what you can improve if you are in this situation, like you work for 30 years in person. One thing will be try to, if you need to say something important, if you need to delegate, try to do it either over Zoom or at least over the phone, which means somewhere where you can stop 1 second and ask any questions.
Right.
Or think even better Zoom because you can read the body language of the other person.
Right.
You can see if they are on board or maybe they're misunderstanding something. Or maybe they don't understand it. And that gives you the feedback you need to be more clear, for example. Another quick tip is if you are not good at writing emails, emails can be bullet points.
Right.
I know some people that, okay, ideally, it would be better if they learn to write good emails. But given the state of the situation, just write a few bullet points with the important things. Ask yourself, what is important? What needs to get across? What I want to say? Write it in bullet points. For some people, it's a great improvement. Another thing is preempt common mistakes. When you are working in person in the same office, if there is a misunderstanding, it gets solved relatively easily because the other person will walk to you, or maybe you will observe what the other person is doing and realize that they're going on the wrong path. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe you will chat at the coffee machine and understand that someone didn't understand something and you can clarify. Instead, remotely, it might happen that if there is a misunderstanding, it will remain a misunderstanding maybe for weeks. So one of the things you need to do if you are remote is to proactively surface, address, and prevent misunderstandings. How do you do that? You have two tools. The first one is to always ask, are there any questions? Or much better, if you're on the phone with someone and you're delegating, you can ask them to rephrase their understanding of what you delegated to them. It seems silly, and usually some of my clients, I need to convince them to try it, but I don't have a single client that tried it and didn't tell me that it was life-changing.
I like that.
You will discover that if you ask the other person to rephrase, you will discover either they misunderstood something or you didn't forgot to say something which was important. It's life-changing. And then the other thing you want to say is you always want to ask yourself, what could be common mistakes? And you want to talk about them. So every time I delegate something remotely, I always ask myself, what could be the most common 2 or 3 mistakes that the other person might make? And I will just tell them not to do that. I make a very simple example. Let's say that I'm maybe delegating someone to prepare an Excel with some customers, which I might some possible customers that I might want to contact. Then I ask myself, what could be common mistakes? Maybe one common mistake is that they don't write enough information.
Mhm.
And maybe another mistake is that they write too much information, and maybe I just want to have a quick list. And
Mhm.
maybe the third possible mistake is that they write to clients which are too small.
Right.
Perfect. I just tell him as I'm delegating, all right, please prepare this Excel and make sure that you write at least what kind of industry those people are. Make sure that there are clients which have at least this kind of revenue, that we can make at least that much money working with them. And I don't need to know everything about them. I just want you to tell me what they're doing. For example, something like that. You will dramatically improve your delegation skill if you ask yourself, what are the common mistakes? And you just talk about them while you're delegating.
No, this is great. And listening to you, I'm thinking of the lessons, and I'm also thinking of my own experience working remotely. And the number one thing that I wrote down is writing, and the other side of writing is reading. So I think that myself, I improved the way I write emails. I try to make sure that everything that could come up is in that particular email. And what I ask of myself and the recipient, because I'm a recipient of some emails, is actually reading the entire email. And hopefully it's not too long and it's concise, but I make sure that everything you might have asked for at this point in time, given what I know, it's in that email. And I noticed that we've made a huge leap. I think all of us, many of us, at least people that I interact with professionally, and, service providers and so on, the quality of emails and the quality of reading has really stepped up. And there are fewer back and forths compared to 5 years ago by a huge amount, at least my perception is. Second thing is, Zoom and video. I feel like the first minutes of the pandemic, lockup and lockdowns and working from home, every possible little conversation was an excuse to set up a video call. And I think we all felt a little bit constrained sitting at home, and maybe it was part of our social interaction. But I noticed how we transitioned to much more efficient Zoom calls. I had a couple of Zoom calls with various service providers the other day, and I noticed how they know what they want to talk about. They know what they expect from me. I get an email explaining everything, and we talk just to finalize certain things. But it's not a 1 hour booking where, oh, let's talk for an hour. It's 15 minutes, it's 25 minutes. And when we're done, nowadays, it's culturally acceptable that we say, we said everything was to say. You have a great day. I'll talk to you later. And I feel like something happened. It's a shared learning experience. And the last point I want to say, it's processes. There was this talk that the magic happens by the water cooler, or the magic happens in the hallways. I think if you rely on the execution of any strategy in your business on those very random moments in the hallway, something might be missing. I know that the creative moments happen in a room where everybody interacts and so on. It's hard to replicate that on a Zoom call. But if something should have been done and it's only done because I ran into Bob on the way to the bathroom, something is not right. There should be a process with a checklist in place that should not leave room for me hoping that I'll run into Bob on the way out of the office or on the way to the bathroom. I'm curious about your thoughts about the processes, but I think there's been a lot of progress, and I'm very impressed how a lot of our service providers have created checklists and processes in places where before it was, if I see you, we'll do it. If I don't see you, we won't do it.
Yeah, exactly. From my privileged position as a consultant, like I've seen like hundreds of companies,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen that the common thread about the successful ones is not much the specific process, but it's that they are deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you mentioned the importance about having ideas, for example.
Right.
That's important. The
Mm-hmm.
specific process can be different,
Of course.
but companies that have ideas are deliberate about having them usually.
Mm-hmm.
And then every company might have their best idea for what's the best, they might have their own idea for what's the best way to get ideas. And probably there is a lot of different answers which depend on the people that you have inside the companies, the type of company, whether you're remote or in person. But the thing is, that's a deliberate decision. That's a question. Like there's been people asking themselves, are we getting enough ideas? What can we do to get more ideas? Or what happened the last few times we had good ideas? and how we can make sure that this happens more frequently, or some variations thereof. So I don't think that there is necessarily a best tool, but there is the idea of being deliberate, of continuous improvement, and so on.
And I think there's a benefit in having in-person meetings. Obviously, we see clients in person as often as we can, and we resumed our normal schedule since COVID. And some people felt more comfortable sooner to see us. Some people see us had to wait to see us, felt comfortable a bit later. So we meet them where they are. And but for employees and bigger teams, I think it's also beneficial to have an opportunity to see each other in person now and then. And I have friends that have more experience with big teams where they meet and they spend time together, sometimes in a pretty location, and they go kayaking. But I think it's a chance to actually see everybody and see where they are. We all evolve, we change, our life situation is not the same, and so on. So it's nice to have a context of who is the person that I get emails from every day that works in a different department. I think we might not have to see them and share every birthday cake with them as we used to, but there's something on a human level that adds a little bit of fills in the picture, gives us a lot of value in that term. I have one last big question for you, Luca. I want to talk about trust. And I think with remote teams, I mean, in general, with an employee and employer, trust is a big thing. But if you don't see them as regularly, if you can't hover over them, if they're working from home or from a different location, there is a two-way trust that has to be maintained. One, the employee has to know that the employer knows everything they do and gets credit for the work they do, but also the employer has to know that the employee is executing on what was assigned to them. I think it's a big ask. I think it's something that all the firms are growing into, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity to take the whole remote experience to a whole new level.
Yes, exactly. And I think that when we talk about trust, it's very important to realize that there are different types of trust and that they are not interchangeable. There is, for example, trust that my colleague is a good person.
Right.
And then there is trust that if I delegate a task to my colleague, he will complete it. And then there is trust that if I work with this person, good things will happen to both of us.
Right.
And you cannot, trust in these three buckets doesn't really overflow from one to another. And so, for example, something I don't like is that when companies do trust building exercises, they tend to be all focused on the personal part. They're completely unrelated to work, which is great to fill the first bucket. For example, the bucket of I trust that this person that my colleague is a good person, but doesn't do anything for the second bucket, which is I trust that if I delegate a task to my colleague, they will competently execute on that.
Right.
And you need also to do trust building on that one. And then the third type of trust, which was I trusted that if I work with the other person, for example, good things will happen to me, I will grow professionally. That's another type of trust which we need to be deliberate. And managers, they need to be deliberate about filling all three buckets. So, for example, how do you fill the second bucket? The one trust that if I delegate a task, that if I collaborate with a colleague, I won't waste my time. You need to maybe set up the collaboration. You need to make sure that people are trained enough. A lot of times, the reason why there is not trust in a team is because people are not trained enough, and they do not necessarily good work. And maybe one person asks for help, the other person is not able to give the help effectively, and then the other person stops asking for help.
I see.
It's a lack of trust, but it's not a lack of trust that the colleague is a good person. Maybe those two colleagues, they will still go get a beer together after work. But maybe they don't trust that at work they can ask questions to each other. So managers need to be deliberate about fostering all types of trust.
And I imagine that some in-person interaction is one of the ways to help build it. I think there was instances in the last few years when people would be hired and they've never met in person the people they work with, and it's I've heard stories how they meet them for the first time and they realize, oh, they're very different than I thought, because Zoom only goes that far. So I think the future is remote for many companies, for many businesses. I think that some sort of a happy middle will be found by different businesses. And not all businesses are alike. So if one solution works for one firm, it might not work for the other. But I think it has disrupted the way we work and it has created a lot of opportunities. I mean, the most obvious one is that you can hire somebody that doesn't necessarily live within the 1 hour, 2 hour commute distance from your office. I mean, think about that. And I've heard so many stories, especially living in New York, where people would give up a job they like because when the spouse is moving to the West Coast, they'll follow them to the West Coast or to Florida or to Europe or to Asia. And I always thought, well, the other spouse could have kept the job and worked remotely. And I think a lot of opportunities could be created just because of that you could have team that's all around. And on a personal level, I notice that you could choose the environment. We started talking about conditions and environment, but the environment that you thrive in, personally and professionally. What are your thoughts about that?
Exactly, completely agree. Like a big reason why there's been a lot of disruption and why some companies found remote work less effective is because they put people who they selected for in-person jobs
Hmm.
suddenly got thrown into an environment that maybe they are not at. But
Hmm.
maybe in a few years, the people who thrive remotely will go to companies which work primarily remotely, and
Hmm.
the people who thrive in person, they will move to companies in person. It's a bit,
Hmm.
if I can make, for example, a soccer analogy. Imagine if no team ever played with counterattack,
Hmm.
and then suddenly all teams decided to play with counterattack. And you need
Hmm.
fast players. But if a team doesn't have fast players, they will find the counterattack is not a good tactic.
Hmm.
But that's because they don't have the right player. But maybe if a few teams stick to counterattack and they get the right players, and the
Hmm.
fast players, they move to teams with counterattack, and the slower players, they move to teams without counterattack, both teams will be more effective in the long run. And I think that's what we will see at work, that we will decide which company to work for, also based on their working style.
It makes me think, if you have two companies that are exactly in the same business and one chooses to be 100% in person, just as a study, as an extreme example, and the other one decides to be 100% remote. And obviously, even 100% remote, I mean, they would still see clients in person. They would still have some in-person interactions with the team. Can be flexible in that extent. And one firm can only hire people within the 30-mile radius, can only work with people that are so close. And it comes at the expense of people being not so happy that they have to live in this particular city, not so happy with the school arrangements, not so happy with the spouse not being where she wants to be or he wants to be, and so on. And the other firm can hire from the whole country or maybe the whole world. The other firm allows people to be, by definition, directionally speaking, as we spoke, follow their happiness by creating the environment. So they can hire anybody and they can have a happier crew and happier clients. I can only see how over a few years, the two different choices in some instances can create very different outcomes. And I'm a little bit biased because I do see benefits of remote work, but I can see how it can really create a big difference between somebody that's 100% in person, making some employees very unhappy, and somebody that's much more flexible and allows employees to work where they want to work from and get to hire somebody from the other end of the country. In Europe, it's the distance you could move from the north to the south of Italy, but it's also a family choice, friend's choice. In the US, you're moving really from one side of the continent to the other. It's a huge ask for some people, I think. So as long as you can keep people happy and productive, whatever way you get there, I think that's the secret to success. And I think you presented some ideas how to communicate better, how to build trust, and how to adapt to this new way of working. Luca, this was wonderful. I highly recommend all 3 books, and I will include the links. Managing Remote Teams, The Control Heuristic, and 100 Truths You Will Learn Too Late. I mean, how can you not read a book that tells you 100 truths that you will learn too late? I think we should all learn all 100, and we touched on a handful as soon as possible. Luca, thank you again for today. You're always very, very generous with your wisdom, knowledge, and time. So I want to thank you for today, and I hope to have you back on the show with other topics in the future.
Thank you so much, Bogumil. It was a pleasure and would be a pleasure to come again.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski. The content of this podcast is for general informational purposes only, and so are the opinions of members of Seacard Associates, a registered investment advisor, and guests of the show. This podcast does not constitute a recommendation to buy or sell any specific security or financial instruments, or provide investment advice or service. Past performance is not indicative of future results. More information on Seacard Associates is available in its Form ADV disclosure documents available at advisorinfo.sec.gov.